Professor Alan Dershowitz, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yeah.
You've been called Israel's lead defender in the court of public opinion, and I wonder, as we're approaching that international jury again, what would you recommend Israel do?
Well, Israel would have nothing to fear from a fair and just application of existing law. Existing law says that the use of human shields, civilian human shields, as Hamas's manual mandates that it does, is an absolute crime, absolute, no exceptions. Whereas Israel's right to fire back and try to hit terrorists or tunnel builders that's a military target. They're entitled to do it unless the value of the target is not proportional to the number of civilians that might be killed. That's a judgment call. In a fog of war, that's very difficult. And any reasonable court would find that Hamas is responsible for the deaths of the civilians that they have used as human shields.
How do you explain then, for example, the State Department saying that the fact that Hamas is shooting from populated areas doesn't justify mistakes like Israel shooting towards an UNRWA school, for example?
Well, first of all, these schools and these shelters should not be placed by the United Nations in the middle of the most densely populated battle zones. There are relatively sparsely populated areas of the Gaza Strip outside of the major cities. And the UN ought to be setting up temporary shelters, perhaps in tents, declare those areas battle-free zones, forbid Hamas fighters and tunnel builders to come into those areas, and then, of course, Israel would have no reason for firing back. But when Hamas fighters use UN shelters in the middle of their crowded cities from which to fire at Israeli soldiers and civilians, and they use them as command centers, then they are to blame. And the United States State Department is simply wrong. Now, I understand the United States State Department saying Israel should do more. Well, the United States should do more. Britain should do more. NATO should do more. In every one of these urban guerrilla warfare battles, civilians die. Many, many more civilians have been killed by the United States than by Israel. And many, many more civilians have been killed in Syria. And yet the world only focuses on Israel, which is fighting in self-defense. So, you know, if there were a fair tribunal, Israel would have nothing to fear at all. But when you are tried in front of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, that's not a fair tribunal. The judges have predetermined the outcome of those kangaroo court trials.
In Riyad al-Maliki, we saw the Palestinian foreign minister was in The Hague pushing for a war crimes case against Israel. How can Israel protect itself and its soldiers from being accused in committing these war crimes? And is there any way to hold Hamas accountable?
Well, that's the hard question. If there were an international tribunal that could fairly assess the role of Hamas and the role of Israel, Israel would have nothing to fear. I would have no difficulty, or any good lawyer would have no difficulty defending Israel's actions. What Israel has done is far better than what most countries have done. In fact, whenever I speak, I challenge my audiences, name a single country in the history of the world faced with what Israel has faced that has had a better record of complying with human rights, protecting civilians, and applying the rule of law. I never get an answer because nobody can name a single country that has done better.
Professor Alan Dershowitz, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for talking to us today.